I'll call to order the County Board meeting for February 13, 2018. We'll begin with an invocation. Ms. Dunbar, would you lead us, please?
Heavenly Father, we come to you today asking for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this meeting. Help us engage in meaningful discussion, allow us to grow closer as a group, and nurture the bonds of community. Grant us the wisdom to govern among conflicting interests and issues and work together in harmony, even when there is honest disagreement. Strengthen in us a sense of the welfare and needs of the people of Kankakee County, and let a keen thirst for justice and rightness guide us. Fill us with your grace, Lord God, as we make decisions that affect the residents of our county. Continue to remind us that all we do here today, all that we accomplish, is for the pursuit of truth, for the greater glory of you, and for the service of humanity. We ask these things in your name. Amen.
Amen. You'll give us a moment here. We have the honor today of having the students from Avis Huff who will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So we're going to ask them to come up front. Many of you may realize the Avis Huff School has some very special programs, and so that's why it's an honor to have them here. We're going to try to get them all in as best we can into the camera view. If we turn and face the flag.
Face the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Tripp. Present. Mr. Washington. Present. Mr. Legess. Mr. Stauffenberg. Present. Mr. Vickery. Present. Mr. Olthoff. Mr. Hess. Mr. Tholen. Present. Mrs. Polk. Mr. McConnell. Present. Mr. Mulcahy. Present. Mr. Scott. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne. Present. Mr. Seroy. Present. Mr. Lear.
Present.
Mr. Hildebrand. Present. Mrs. Weber. Present. Mr. Einfeld. Mrs. Peters. Present. Mrs. Evans. Present. Mr. Payton. Present. Mrs. Parker. Present. Ms. Dunbar. Present. Mr. Ritter. Mr. Kinzinger. Present. Mr. Fairfield. Present. Mr. Wheeler.
A quorum is present. For public commentary, we have two requests. Kelly Bloom.
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me okay? My name is Kelly Bloom. For those of you who don't know me, I am the shelter manager at Kankakee County Animal Control. I am here today with BARC board member Christy Slaby, and we just wanted to remind everybody that this Sunday there is a fundraising event at Applebee's. It is a pancake breakfast. You can eat pancakes for $8, and that will help generate funds for the new building that we are hoping to get accomplished. I also wanted to let you know that on March 10th, BARC will also be having a stand-up comedy event at the Knights of Columbus called Raise the Woof, and tickets for that are available online. Christy and I will stay throughout the meeting in case anybody needs some more information or would like flyers. Thank you very much.
And Kathleen Roybal.
My name is Kathleen Roybal. I'm with the organization Connect.
Could you come a little closer to the mic, please?
Pardon me? Okay. Our organization has been working for several months to learn what the Kankakee Sheriff's Department is planning in terms of incarcerating U.S. immigration and customs enforcement detainees, as well as other individuals. Through Freedom of Information Act requests, we have collected data in terms of total detainees, as well as the number of detainees from different subgroups, such as federal prisons dating back to January of 2017. Recent data suggests a troubling trend is emerging and underscores our desire to know what the county's plan for incarceration as well as revenue generation is now and in the future. The data from the first 6 months of 2017 shows an average daily inmate population of 500 adults with a slight upward trend. Of these 500 inmates, around 100 each day were ICE detainees, and the county data indicates all of the ICE detainees are from out of the county. Of note is that on any given day, almost 300 of the 500 detainees are from out of the county. This includes inmates from other counties in Illinois, as well as some from Indiana. The county has shared with us the agreement with ICE is a payment of $80 per day for ICE detainees, but we have not received for the proceeds for holding other inmates from out of the county. Now, data we have just received as part of an October FOIA request shows that since August, the number of ICE detainees is trending upward and reached 134 in October and 153 in November. This represents an increase in monthly revenue of $120,000 between July and November, and this is just ICE detainees. The total number of inmates is also on the rise. The total population rose to 604 in November. We have some questions. Is the county plan to increase revenue for the county by adding inmates from other counties? Does an increase in detainees actually help to balance the county budget, or does it just force the expansion of the sheriff's department with no impact on other county departments or overall budget? Or is it possible that it just puts a strain on the county sheriff's department? Taking a different tact, is this the business that we want to be in? How is the economic approach different from a private person that profits from increased incarceration rates? Is this the business that we want to be in from an ethical standpoint? So we ask, what is the plan? We would like a full accounting of all revenue aspects of our incarceration program, including the total cost associated with an increase of 100 inmates over a 3-month period, and the articulation of the county's plan in this area.
Thank you. I have no communications. There's no presentations, but nothing for certificates of recognition this month. So we move to the minutes of the January 9th meeting. I entertain a motion to approve those minutes. Mr. Byrne and Mr. Vickery, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Claims Committee report.
Mr. Chairman and members of the County Board, your Committee on County Claims would beg leave to report they've examined the following claims presented and recommend payment. The clerk is hereby authorized and directed to issue orders to the several claimants payable out of the funds as follows. For the Highway Fund, $239,407.67. All other funds, $17,405.99, for a total for the month of December 2017 of $256,813.66. In the General Fund, $830,420.63. All other funds, $4,683,184.41, for a total for the month of December 2017 of $5,513,605.04.
A motion to approve. Ms. Seroy, Ms. Parker, all in favor of the approval, say aye.
Roll call.
Aye. Oh, wait a minute, this is a roll call, I'm sorry.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell.
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
A motion carries. We move to department reports.
The county collector's report, monthly report for December 2017. Total cash in banks and investments, $782,111.90. The county treasurer's monthly report for December 2017. Total cash and investments of $782,111.90. The December 2017 Kankakee County Recorder monthly report for December 2017. Disbursement fees paid to the treasurer, $111,236.89. The county clerk monthly report for December 2017. Total fees, $33,217.08. Animal control monthly report for December 2017. Total fees of $24,418. IPTIP building fund, $155.04. And total animals handled, 66. And the monthly resolution list for February 2018, total of the county, $13,419.40. And the regional superintendent's quarterly report ending November 30th, 2017 is on file.
We need a motion to combine and accept the reports. Ms. Dunbar, Mr. Tripp seconds that. This will be a voice vote. All in favor of combining and accepting, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. Committee presentations and resolutions, the consent agenda. You have the items of the consent agenda in front of you. Are there any items you wish to remove?
I'm going to ask to remove number 16.
Number 16. Are there any other items we wish to remove? If there are no other items we wish to remove, could we have a motion to approve the consent agenda? Mr. McKay, Ms. Evans, that's a roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield. Motion passed.
A motion carried. All right, number 16, resolution 16, polling place change. Could we read that into the record?
Polling place change, precinct 14 from Pioneer Park to the Kankakee Housing Authority. Whereas the Kankakee County Board established the various polling places for the election precincts of Kankakee County under the authority of 10 ILCS 5/11-2. And whereas Dan Hendrickson, the County Clerk of Kankakee County, recommends a temporary polling place change to take effect for only the primary election to be held on March 20th, 2018. Whereas the County Clerk has determined the current polling place for Kankakee Precinct 14, located at Pioneer Park, shall be changed to the Kankakee Housing Authority, located at 185 St. Joseph Avenue, Kankakee, to best accommodate voters. And whereas at the regular Executive Committee meeting of January 23rd, 2018, after review, discussion, and consideration, the committee voted to concur with the recommendation of the County Clerk and change the polling place for Kankakee Precinct 14 to the Kankakee County Housing Authority for the upcoming election on March 20th, 2018. Now therefore be it resolved by the Kankakee County Board that the polling place for Kankakee Precinct 14 has been changed to the Kankakee Housing Authority located at 185 St. Joseph Avenue, Kankakee, Illinois.
We need a motion to accept, Mr. Seroy, Ms. Dunbar. Discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I voted for this with a caveat because we knew that there were issues at Pioneer Park as far as the building is concerned. But one of the things I do want to make certain, and I'm sure Dan has probably already have done this, is that the voters are made aware of this so that we don't get a lot of unexpected calls because they were not made aware. I believe that those that are registered voters, something has been sent out to their residents to basically inform them of this. Am I correct?
We waiting on approval from the county board before we sent those, but we do have postcards that will be sent to all the registered voters in that affected precinct to let them know that for the primary election, it will be changed to the housing authority.
Okay, just want to make sure that's clarified. Other than that, I have no objections.
I didn't want to send anything out until we had approval from the county board.
Yeah, all right.
Mr. Washington.
Point of correction, isn't that 185 North St. Joseph? I live there.
I believe you're correct.
All right then.
Okay.
I live on the street.
Any other discussion? Let's go ahead and have a roll call on this then.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield. Motion passed.
Motion carries. We move to highways and buildings.
We've got to, Mr. Mayor, we've got to back up. We've got to at least read in the titles of the consent agenda into the record. Diane's correct on that.
Okay. We need, all right, we need to back up for a minute here. We didn't actually do a roll call vote on the,
No, there was the vote was appropriate, but we need to read the titles of
we need to read the
of
titles
everything on
into
the
the,
consent agenda into the record.
into the record.
And then we
Okay.
can just do a voice vote,
All right.
reconfirm.
All right. So I didn't get us to read the titles of those on the consent agenda. We need to ask the clerk to do that, please.
The appointment of Ralph Mercier to the St. Anne Fire Protection District Board. The appointment of Dr. Diane Fedro to the Kankakee County Animal Welfare Advisory Committee as a member at large. The appointment of Jeff Jarvis to the Kankakee County Board of Examiners and Appeals, architect. The reappointment of David Tyson to the Kankakee County Board of Examiners and Appeals, engineer. The reappointment of Janine Wolf to the Kankakee County Emergency Telephone System Board. The reappointment of Patrick McConnell to the Kankakee County Board of Health. The reappointment of Loretto Cowhig to the Kankakee County Regional Planning Commission.
And just to verify that we've done all those properly, could we have a voice vote on that? So all in favor of that consent agenda, say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. That motion then carries. You good there?
Yep.
Okay. Then we'll go on to building and highways. We need to deal with each of these resolutions separately, so we go to the first resolution.
Resolution authorizing the county board chairman to sign local agency agreement for federal participation and approaching matching tax funds for resurfacing County Highway 37. Whereas Kankakee County is preparing to construct a hot mix asphalt overlay on County Highway 37, FAS 1322, 7000 South Road, from 2500 East Road to 4000 East Road, using federal surface transportation funds allocated to the county for the purpose of paying 80% of the cost of this project. And whereas the state of Illinois is requesting that they receive assurance from the Kankakee County that 20% local funds required to match these federal funds will be made available for this construction project, designated as Section 13-00115-05-RS, estimated to cost $403,399. And whereas the Highway and Buildings Committee at the January 11th, 2018 meeting discussed and recommends funding and approval of the attached agreement. Therefore, be it resolved that the County of Kankakee will use $90,000 of matching tax funds for the purpose of matching the federal funds on an 80% federal, 20% local basis. Be it further resolved that the chairman of the county board or his designee be authorized to execute the attached local agency agreement for federal participation on this project, the same to be attested by the county clerk. Be it further resolved that the county clerk is hereby directed to transmit 5 certified copies of this resolution to the district office of the Department of Transportation at Ottawa, Illinois.
We need a motion to approve. Ms. Peters, a second. Mr. Washington. Is there any discussion on the resolution? If not, a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington. Mr. Stauffenberg. Mr. Vickery. Mr. Tholen. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Seroy. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand. Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield.
Motion passes. In terms of the next resolution, it's short enough. You have a copy of it. If we could get a motion to approve and waive the reading of the motion. Mr. Stauffenberg and Mr. Tripp. All right. So if we'd read the title into the record.
Resolution appropriating county bridge funds to construct a bridge on the Livingston-Kankakee County line.
Is there any discussion on that motion? Hearing no discussion, we will need a roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington. Mr. Stauffenberg. Mr. Vickery. Mr. Tholen. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Seroy. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand. Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Ms. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield. Motion passed.
All right. Our next resolution is also short enough that we don't need a reading if we can get a motion to approve and waive the reading of the resolution. Mr. McConnell moves. Ms. Evans seconds. Read the title of the resolution into the record, please.
A resolution authorizing the county board chairman to sign a proposal for NBI bridge inspection services and appropriating county joint bridge funds.
And once again, we're spending money. We'll need a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington. Mr. Stauffenberg. Mr. Vickery. Mr. Tholen. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Seroy. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand. Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield. Motion passes.
Motion carries. We move to Executive Committee. And once again, if we could get a motion to approve and waive the reading of the resolution. Mr. Tholen, Mr. Byrne, could you read the resolution into the record, please?
Resolution regarding closing the county clerk's office for all non-election matters on the primary and general election days.
Is there any discussion on that motion? Hearing no discussion, we need once again a roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington. Mr. Stauffenberg. Mr. Vickery. Mr. Tholen. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Seroy. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand. Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield.
Motion carries. The next resolution, once again, a motion to approve and waive the reading. Mr. Payton, Ms. Dunbar, would you read that title into the record, please?
Resolution of the County Board authorizing the County Board Chairman to sign an agreement with Platinum Technology Resource LLC.
Okay, any discussion? Hearing no discussion, a roll call vote, please. It's spending money.
Mr. Tripp. Aye. Mr. Washington. Aye. Mr. Stauffenberg. Aye. Mr. Vickery. Aye. Mr. Tholen. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Mulcahy. Aye. Mr. Snipes. Aye. Mr. Byrne. Aye. Mr. Seroy. Aye. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand. Aye. Mrs. Weber. Aye. Mrs. Peters. Aye. Mrs. Evans. Aye. Mr. Payton.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar. Aye. Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Motion carries. All right, we move to the resolution dealing with the Economic Alliance. A motion to approve and waive the reading. Mr. Vickery, a second. Ms. Parker. Any discussion? Ms. Peters.
Yeah, I was just wondering, how does this affect our budget? How much does it cost us, and where is it in the, I noticed there's no employees under Economic Alliance, and yet we're paying for employees. So I just want to clarify that for the record.
Okay, that is part of the planning department budget. Our contribution, which is dealing with the fringe benefits, is $40,000. Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My copy is highlighted. Is that the differences in this, is that the difference in this agreement compared to what's previously been signed, or are there other changes of which changed this year compared to previous years?
One of the things that happened when there was some transition here is that we did not recognize the role that the county board played in terms of the employment of the Economic Alliance individual, the people that work for the Economic Alliance, and so that was part of the change.
I didn't catch that. My question is, and I think you're answering, but I wasn't certain. There appears to be highlighted portions. I'm looking at page 4. Is
Yes.
that the only change in this agreement? Or are there other changes from the previous year? And 7. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
As I understand it, those are the changes.
So how was the employment handled before with on page 7? If that's a change, that talks about the IMRF fund contributions. How was that handled before?
I'm not sure if, Delbert, do you know, can you speak to that at all?
Andy's been handling that.
Okay. Mr. Nugent, do you have some information on that?
I don't believe they were in that.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly which portion you're addressing, but I assume it's the part where previously the Economic Alliance president was also the county planner.
Correct.
Mike Van Mill served in two roles. So he was a county employee as a county planner. Also, he was a county employee as the Economic Alliance president. When Mike Van Mill left, those roles were split. Delbert is now the county planner, and I am the Economic Alliance president. And this agreement is what then guarantees that the Economic Alliance president is a employee of the county, because before it was done with, by one person holding 2 roles.
That is,
So did
Mr. Hildebrand.
I'm sorry, Brian.
Let's see, where are you? 6.
Okay, right there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question is then, we start paying IMRF benefits for?
We have been paying them
Okay.
all along, so there's no change in the financial cost.
All right, so we were paying it to Mr. Van Mill, correct?
Well,
And
because
also-
he was a dual employee, we would have been paying him in that dual role. And when the split occurred, part of the financial procedures that we followed is we paid for the IMRF for the for Mr. Nugent as part of that split. So that it's really no change in the financial arrangement.
All right. And he is considered an employee of the county then, because?
That is
all right.
correct.
All right, okay. Thank you.
Ms. Dunbar?
Does this affect all the employees? I know.
Yes.
Yes, it does.
Thank you.
What, 9? Or no, you're 10.
According to this, then, all full-time employees receive IRMF benefits. Is that the previous way it was handled?
Yeah, yes. I'm sorry.
According to what I'm reading here, IMRF, all full-time employees will receive those benefits. Is that the way it has always been handled in the past?
That's the
Not
way it's
new.
always been handled in the past.
The only new thing is to
And
cover the present.
really, we've got 2 full-time employees, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, we'll move to a roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Vickery?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. McConnell?
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Evans? Mr. Payton?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
The motion passes. We move on to finance. Or wait a minute, we've got one more on under executive, I'm sorry. In terms of Convention and Visitors Bureau, could we have a motion to approve and waive the reading of the resolution? Mr. Vickery and Mr. Payton, seconds. All right, discussion. Any discussion on this? Mr. Snipes?
Yes. Just for the purpose of clarification, because I know we have 2 issues that have been before us. The first is the IMRF issue. This issue is not germane to that issue. This is just simply extending the current agreement until we reach agreement at some point in time. Is that correct?
That is correct. The intention here is to be able to work out a full new agreement with the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and issues in terms of pension will be part of the discussion. So this simply extends the agreement so that we have time to complete all those discussions and arrive at a conclusion what to deal with any questions that are arrived. It also allows us to move into clearly making this an intergovernmental agreement where under the previous, what will happen is we'll move into an intergovernmental agreement so that under the previous, it was a different arrangement. But this is just an extension of the existing agreement and no changes. Ms. Peters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, if we enter into or extend this and they are looking for IMRF, doesn't that give them a leg to stand on that we are contributing to them so that maybe they could possibly be an employee of the county? I'm just wondering legally, state's attorney maybe?
No, they would not be an employee of the county as I understand it. And the technical aspects or the legal aspects of that will be discussed when the new agreement is put in place. So this is just an extension right now. We can go into the pros and cons of whatever new agreement is reached when that is presented to first the committee and then to the full board.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Discussion? Hearing none, a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Vickery?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen? Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Okay. Mr. McConnell?
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes? Mr. Byrne. Mr. Seroy. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield.
Motion carries. Now we can move to finance. The intergovernmental funding resolution. Can we have a motion to approve and waive the reading of the resolution? Mr. Washington, a second. If we're going to discuss this, we need to have a second to the motion. Mr. Fairfield. All right, could we read the, go ahead and read the title of the resolution.
Resolution of the County Board of Kankakee County regarding general fund interfund borrowing.
Mr. McCarty, would you want to speak to this a little to explain? Yes, please.
Good morning. Is this on?
It should be.
Okay. Good morning. You have two items before you, the interfund borrowing and then in a second, the tax anticipation warrants. These two serve as our lifeline for cash flow for the county. The interfund borrowing is a snapshot as of 11/30. It's used for two purposes. One is to record in the official document the comprehensive annual financial report, or better known, known as the audit report, the year-end audit report. It gives a snapshot of where the cash balance was at that moment in time. This is subject to change every year because you know, it is out of our control when we receive federal payments, state payments, tax distributions, etc. So every year this can fluctuate. This is a snapshot. We've been doing this every year, and it also leads us into the new fiscal year. It gives from the county board authorization to continue to do this lifeline activity. So that's a kind of an oversight of that, where the dollar amounts.
Would it be correct to say that the snapshot this year may be a little bit confusing if you make a comparison because of the fact that there were some revenues we did not receive in timing that we had received in 2016? So actually, in terms of our financial situation, we're making some significant improvement, although if you looked at this, it would be difficult to tell that.
That's correct. Yeah, one example is our property tax distribution, and at least in 2016, the entire distribution, you know, had taken place as of 11/30. This year, there was also some in December and January. Had that happen in a similar situation, this number would be better. So yeah, there's advances. It's just again, this is a timing of cash report, so it can fluctuate. It could fluctuate better or worse by $1 million just because of timing. You know, I mean, every year, which doesn't reflect the overall condition. It's just more of a snapshot of that particular moment in time. So,
any questions, Mr. Snipes?
I do know that we have been doing this for quite some time. I also know that we are trying to downsize the amount that we in a farm borrow, but what raises my eyebrow, and I was looking around, I don't know if I saw him here, but the auditor, I'm looking at some writing saying refuse due to borrowing, and it's kind of faint to me. Is it 380,000 above last year or whatever it is? Why, what's that concern? What is it that was his concern as to why he didn't feel comfortable signing the document? But then he puts in a brevity concerning the reason as to why he kind of object to affixing his signature to this particular document.
I don't think he's here, and I'm not sure it would be appropriate for us to try to speak for him. So,
well, I know it wouldn't be appropriate.
That is a question you could raise directly to him, I would suggest.
But if we have to vote on that, would it not be apropos, because I'm thinking he's probably shared it, maybe with the finance or someone, but if not, I would not feel comfortable until I find out why an auditor would not put his name to a document because he had concerns.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Dunbar?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of questions. First of all, it appears that we do this in arrears, dated 11/30, and I know when we saw it at Finance, it was the 24th of January. Is this something that happens and then we approve it after the fact?
Mr. McCarthy?
This was the cash snapshot as of 11/30/2017. So,
But that money had already been borrowed.
this happens actually on 365 days of the year. This is how, like I said, this is our lifeline. We officially do a snapshot as of the date of the year because of the official financial reporting requirements.
Right.
And also leads us in. But the general fund at this point is always in a negative.
Right, and
situation.
I'm not questioning the rationale. I'm questioning the fact that it's happening without county board approval or after the fact. Is that the case?
No.
It happens all throughout the year, but we only
You also
see it once a year?
in the treasurer's report every month. The county board approves it every month in the treasurer's report. If you look at the treasurer's report in the general fund, you'll see what that monthly balance is every month.
Right, but this document that's signed is not every month. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So this document, we're approving things that already happened. Is that correct?
And is currently happening and continues to happening. So it sets us up to continue to do it in 2018. And
This
it's a
authorizes
snapshot of,
us to
11/30.
continue to operate.
And do we ever move this money back?
A lot of it does get moved back during the property tax distributions.
Why is that funny?
Well, I think if we understand this, there's two elements going on here. One in terms of the cash flow, and we need to, as I understand it, have this in regard to that cash flow.
Understood.
The second thing that is going on is in terms of as our budget has improved, the need for this type of borrowing will decline. First, we're going to have to get to the point where we don't need tax anticipation warrants, and then as we build up a reserve, I can remember a number of years ago we passed a resolution that we wanted to set aside a certain amount of our revenue as a part of being able to take care of those dry months, as Chairman Wheeler's referred to it. So we would not be doing this, and in effect we would be paying it back, to use your language, if we had reserve revenue. At the present time, that is not available. We can't even operate without our tax anticipation warrants. So on the other hand, it's in my understanding that many local governments have a tendency, have a practice, not just a tendency, a practice of this type of interfund borrowing, simply because taxpayers have not chosen to have enough taxes imposed to create that kind of a reserve. These are different funds that we can move back and forth with no penalty really to the fund.
Understood. If you don't mind me, just one other comment.
Sure.
I understand the process and the reason behind it. I just want to state my concern that it's ongoing. It seems to be authorized by the finance director and the county board chairman, and we vote on it once or twice a year, and we do see those movements, but I'm just concerned that it's happening we're approving it in arrears.
Okay. Mr. Kissinger?
I understand, and I'm a new board member, and I understand the difference between cash and accrual. It's my understanding, and I have the utmost respect for Mr. McCarty. I have the utmost respect for Mr. McCarty, and it's my understanding, and I'd like to hear him say it again, that the county is in a better financial position than in previous years, and that the trend is positive, and that we're looking at a cash flow thing here, which is a requirement. We have payroll and things that have to be done, so it doesn't matter what we borrow on a moment in time, as long as that trend is positive. And I'd like to have Steve speak to that directly, and then I'm ready to vote.
Mr. McCarty?
Yeah, the trend is positive. We'll see a positive trend in the general fund tort and pension. We're very close to finishing that up, and we'll be bringing that to finance for the year end for 11/30/2017. So yes, the county board is making significant advances overall, and unfortunately, you know, the cash flow, the timing of cash flow can sometimes not necessarily always reflect that, but because it is a timing issue, as this report is potentially compared to what we did last year. So unfortunately, that part's out of our control when it actually arrives. But as far as overall benefit and gain, yes, there's significant gain again this year. Yes.
Ms. Evans? Let's see, 9 or 8. What do you want? 5? I can't see. Can't see your number. 8.
I guess to continue Ms. Dunbar's line of questioning, is this the month, February, every year, the month that we bring up, no, not run out of money,
No.
bring up this resolution to approve it again for another annual period of time? Is that correct?
Once a year, we need to make this resolution, is my understanding. Is that correct, Mr. McCarty? In order to meet the requirements of an audit. So that's why it's done on an annual basis. It's only dealing with the requirements of the audit. We don't need to do it every month because we don't have a full-scale audit every month. Ms. Peters?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess now I'm getting a little confused because we did vote on borrowing from the highway department, and that would be an interfund borrow, correct? Or do we do it just sometimes when we take a big chunk, or how does that work?
I think the interfund borrowing from the
It's
highway.
identified on the sheet, the current interfund borrowing with the highway department. Last year, we did an additional amount for a short period of time, and then we returned that amount with an additional $100,000. So this sheet identifies the matching tax, Fund 430 and Fund 440 are the continuing interfund borrowing with the highway department.
Ms. Dunbar?
Thank you. I believe the ordinance calls for an emergency, and I absolutely understand that meeting payroll is an emergency. I'm not denying that it's necessary, but is there a document that says there's an emergency, we need to do that, or is that this document? And is this document legitimate without the auditor's signature?
I'm not sure.
So the chairman had asked our office to research that issue, and there is a state statute which does not seem, in case law, which does not seem to require the auditor's signature, and then there is a county ordinance that seems to require the auditor's signature. So you have a county ordinance that in my interpretation requires the auditor's signature, and then you have state law. We're not home rule, so we couldn't be, I'm not sure that we would trump state law, but you know, if the board has questions on that, we can research it further. But I know state law does not require the auditor's signature. County ordinance seems to require the auditor's signature. And just as a point, Mr. McCarty, you had said that the money is some of it's paid back around tax time, but all of it is paid back on or before November 30th, the last day of the fiscal year, out of the general fund back into those special funds, because that's what the law requires, correct?
That's what the law says, and that's the intent, but unfortunately the general fund has not been in a financial position to be able to repay everything back
And when that's paid back out of the general fund into the special funds, that drops the general fund down into a negative.
Correct.
So it's paid back on paper.
Right.
Mr. Snipes.
That was my argument. The valid reports are made from the accounting perspective is we say and we sign a document or resolution stating that these funds will be paid back. In retrospect, it's only on paper, but not in practice. And so as a result, this has been going on for quite some time. While I do understand that their state law or state statute that may be out there, I'm wondering if that statute has ever been challenged at any given point. Has there been any ruling by either the Third District Appellate Court or any appellate court or the Supreme Court as to if anyone has ever challenged whether the auditor's signatures, because certainly the purpose of the auditor is to to be the watchdog on the finances as far as that's concerned. And without that signature, if we have required it, does the state mandate it or is it more discretionary? It says may or shall. So that's what I'm looking for. But I would feel uncomfortable to vote on something that the auditor has not signed without hearing why he has not signed it. Maybe the other county board members might want to tread that water, but I'm saying that I can't without knowing as to why. And maybe it could be just a simple, concern or whatever. But nevertheless, intelligence must dictate that we need to, before we put our blessings on something, know why something is not signed.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other discussion? If not, we're ready for a vote. Mr. Stauffenberg.
Just one comment. Doesn't it say why he didn't sign it right here? Because it's $380,000 more than before, so that's his statement.
Thank you. If there is no other discussion or comments, we're ready for a roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell.
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Nay.
Mr. Byrne.
Nay.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Nay.
Mrs. Evans.
Nay.
Mr. Payton.
Nay.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar.
Nay.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield. Motion passes.
The motion passes. We move to property tax abatement.
I just don't know. But the
Snipes.
county can probably, state attorney probably can help you out. When we are borrowing funds, is it a simple majority vote, or do we have to, because we're borrowing it, is it a 3/5 or some type of vote? Other than, what's the vote?
I believe it's a simple majority.
Just a simple majority?
You're interfund borrowing. You're not borrowing coming out.
Oh, okay. As long as it's internal.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
just a comment. If you want to make payroll and you want to pay your bills, you interfund borrow. It's that simple. I mean, you can get into the auditor question, you can get into anything. But if you want to make your payroll and pay your bills, you interfund borrow. It's that simple.
Okay. All right, thank
We've
you.
been doing it for years. Thank you.
The property tax resolution may have a motion to approve and waive the reading of the motion. Mr. Washington, a second. Mr. Stauffenberg. What could we read the title of that into the
Resolution of the County Board of Kankakee County regarding property tax abatement for tax year 2017 payable 2018 to be abated in its entirety.
Is there any discussion on this? If there is no discussion, I'll move to a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Vickery?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. McConnell?
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Evans? Mr. Payton? Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Motion carries. We move to the resolution on the tax anticipation warrants, and we have a motion to approve and to waive the reading of the resolution. Mr. Tripp, Mr. Kissinger, discussion. Any discussion on this? Before we have the discussion, maybe we should read the title of the ordinance, please.
Ordinance of the County Board of Kankakee County, Illinois. Ordinance authorizing the issuance of the not to exceed 2.5 million corporate purpose and tort purpose and tax anticipation warrants 2018 in anticipation of the collection of taxes levied for the year 2017 and payable in the year 2018 by the County Board of Kankakee County, Illinois for corporate and tort purposes.
All right, now, any discussion? Mr. Snipes?
I know that we use, you use the terminology where there is no money in the treasurer. I'm more comfortable with the word insufficient or deficient. But when you say no money, that means there's just none in there. It, you know, it's that absolute tends to bother me. But I guess if that's it's been passed by the state's attorney, I guess it should work. But that no absolute tends to tell me I don't have even a penny. Yeah.
We should note for the board and for the public that this anticipation tax warrants are for $2.5 million. It represents really a signal that the banks see us making significant progress in terms of our financial situation. At one point, we, of course, last year had $3 million in tax anticipation warrants, and we were informed by the banks that we were only going to get $2 million in this year. After we presented, or the chairman and the finance director presented our financial position to the banks, they were willing to grant warrants that were 2.5 million. So I think that the good response that we got from the banks is a signal that both board members should recognize and that the public should be aware of. Any other discussion? Hearing no other discussion, we'll have a roll call vote, please.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington? Aye. Mr. Stauffenberg?
Aye.
Mr. Vickery?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. McConnell?
Aye.
Mr. Mulcahy?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters? Mrs. Evans? Mr. Payton?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Okay, I do. All right, motion carries. Mr.
Footnote, just a footnote to what we've been doing. Our budget this year includes $1.5 million in debt reduction. That's a line item in our budget. And then I would add one other comment. It's unfortunate that the auditor doesn't want to pay our bills or make payroll. Thank you.
Mr. Snipes.
I think that would probably be kind of premature to say that he doesn't want to. I believe that an individual that has objections to something may have a concern. I think it's a due diligence of the county board to basically hear those objections. That's why we're here for. But to say that he doesn't want to, I don't think is a fair statement. And then that also speaks in his behalf when, in essence, you don't know exactly why or what his concerns is. And until he gets here to speak for himself, it will be premature to kind of make that kind of statement.
All right, let's move on our agenda, please.
Contact him and ask him to present his position. And that's, he's not available. Thank you. Himself.
Let's move on to the other business. We have some openings to announce. There are 2 openings on the Kankakee County Public Buildings Commission, 1 opening on the Kankakee County Regional Planning Commission, 4 openings on the Board of Examiners and Appeals, a commercial contractor, residential contractor, electrician, and plumber, 1 opening on Joe Beans Drainage District, 1 opening on the Mantino Drainage District number 3, 1 opening on the Mantino Drainage District number 9, 1 opening on the Kankakee Valley Airport Authority, and that is the current openings. Per the agenda at this point, we need to enter executive session for a motion dealing with pending litigation 5 ILC 120/2C11 and for review of executive session minutes 5 LICS 120/2C21. Can we have a motion to move into executive session? Mr. Payton moves, Mr. Tripp seconds. All in, that'll be a roll call vote.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Stauffenberg.
Aye.
Mr. Vickery.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mulcahy. Mr. Snipes. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Seroy. Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mr. Hildebrand. Mrs. Weber. Mrs. Peters. Mrs. Evans. Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker. Ms. Dunbar. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Fairfield. Motion carries.
The motion carries. We'll take a brief break here so that we can change to executive session recording.
That's good.
Ready to go back into regular session. Let's go back into regular session. We'll note for the record that Mr. Tripp has left. And Mr. Snipes is still here. Okay. We need a motion for release of executive session minutes. Mr. Seroy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion that we release the June 16th, 2016, December 13th, 2016, and June 13th, 2017 executive session minutes.
Mr. McConnell seconded to that.
And then just for the record before a vote, the January 13, 2015, August 11, 2015, July 12, 2016 closed session minutes, those will remain to be not released due to pending litigation. The November 29th, 2017 minutes will not be released due to ongoing collective bargaining negotiation. And January 9th, 2018 will continue to not be released due to pending or imminent litigation and specific employee discussion.
All right. We have a motion and a second. If there's no discussion, a voice vote is in order. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. New business. I have one announcement under new business. Remember to RSVP to Diane in terms of the Farm Bureau luncheon. The deadline for that RSVP is Friday, and certainly anyone that can make the Farm Bureau luncheon, that is always an important way to contact constituents. Is there any other new business to come before the board? Mr. Vickery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Andy had discussed that there were many possible applications for different energy farms. I'll make it broad. And I think that some of the members here have not been through ex parte communications. And I think it would be apropos if the state's attorney would communicate with all of the board members what to expect if those applications are forwarded to the county and are official.
We can do that.
Thank you.
Put together something for the board on that.
Any other new business? If there's no other new business, a motion to adjourn. Mr. McKay, is there a second? Ms. Peters, all in favor of the motion say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. We are adjourned.